Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I'm glad that you are joining me. It has been quite the recovery weekend for me. We officially went on to spring break, and I survived a couple different birthday parties over the last few days. I have a intense ambivalence about birthday parties. Ambivalence is all about love and hate, right? Love side is I feel immensely honored by the grace and love that's expressed in the birthday parties, particularly my students. They don't have to do that. And if you've been on the Instagram feed, you will have seen what I call the lovable group of weirdos that did my quote unquote birthday party for me in the in the capstone class. So there's that, and then also just the day of my birthday. The students were kind enough to serenade me, and I walked away with a pan of brownies, which nobody is going to complain about at some level, probably. Excuse me. So anyway, that's that. I survived it. This week is kind of an interesting week for me because it not only has my birthday week or day in it, but also has my adoption day. I'm an adopted kid, and so I have my adoption day in it as well, which was a year after my parents adopted me at 8 days old, and I created enough havoc that in their lives that they actually decided to make it legal, which is amazing grace as well when you think about it in terms of adoption. So that being what it is, it has been quite the week. And I said to somebody, I felt a little bit like the fattened calf with all the goodies and treats and everything. It's capped off by my weekend having a birthday party with my grandson, who was a St. Patty's Day baby. And so we had a joint party together. And he got rollerblades. I didn't. And all the necessary accoutrements to stay safe, and was out practicing even today as I looked out the window. I can't imagine why my family would never want me to be on skates ever. I don't get that. If you don't get that joke, you missed a prime opportunity because I went skating the day after Christmas and promptly fell and knocked myself out. And but other than that, everything was great. It was wonderful. Shortest ER visit I ever had, and everything was fine. All my neurology was okay. I could have told them that. It would have been a lot less expensive, but nobody believes me, so what do I know? So anyway, so welcome to the Psych Monologues. I'm Dr. Ray Mitch, your host, and what you're listening to, if you've never heard of the Psych Monologues before, it's a podcast that explores this intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. It is the voice, if you will, of Stained Glass International. It was formed over the summer. SGI, the mission is to equip, empower, and encourage the next generation of Christians to live authentically in their relationship with Jesus, others, and themselves. I think the thing to keep in mind here is you can have a relationship with somebody that you're still not sure about. That's entirely possible. We do that all the time. We just cover and make it sound better than it is. So to live authentically in that, I think Jesus can handle it if we're mad at him, or if we're not sure that he's the real thing, or if he's not worthy of the kind of trust we think he deserves or should have, or at least we're told other people say we should have. And so what we're trying to develop through SGI is what I call outposts for the heart and communities for the soul. And outposts for the heart is a bigger concept. I probably need to set aside a whole podcast talking about what that means. But that being said, that's what we're about. That's what SGI is about. There's a lot on the horizon, kind of just peeking over the horizon about activities and things like that SGI is going to be involved in. And so that's coming down the road. Not I don't know how far along, but it's promising. Let me put it that way. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax. Let's talk about the issues that matter the most to you, where you live, what you think, how you feel about living life, not only with yourself but others and with God Himself. So I'm embarking on what I had said last week of a three-part, not a three-part series. I'm doing 3 different series at the same time. One is on the broken people of the Bible. The other one is on barriers that we have to God. And I covered on a previous podcast the anger being one of them. And the last one I want to spend some time looking at in some measurable depth. And this is probably going to sound a little bit more academic, I suppose. Maybe not. Is just what does the spiritual journey actually look like? The funny thing about it is, when you're born, you don't come out with a checklist of how to grow up. And nobody really gives you one, really. Now, they give your parents that, but that's a secret to all of us. But it's not until young adulthood or thereabouts that suddenly we make growing up a checklist, something I can do. And so what I want to look at is that in terms of our spiritual journey, what we're on, what we're doing, how do we engage God, where we go south with God. In a lot of ways, there's a lot in here for that too, because there are points in time in our journey that we can have this devastating kind of accident, and somebody hits us, or something hits us, or we drive off the road, whatever that might be. And so what I'm going to look at is something that is referred to as stages in the life of faith, but I hate the metaphor of a stage, because usually we turn it into a checklist. So I want to look at and what I'm using as kind of my springboard is a little book you can pick up yourself and take a look at. It's called The Critical Journey: Stages in the Life of Faith. The 2 authors is Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick. And you can look it up, take a look at it. There's a lot that I'm not covering out of that because I want to highlight some things specifically. But before we actually go into starting to talk about this whole idea of journey, I think there are certain things with 2 key principles that we need to be sure we get in place first, okay? So, and when I say that, imagine for a moment that, you and a friend decide to go on a road trip. And my hunch is that one of the 2 of you, or both of you, will, well, I shouldn't say this. I guess, what's funny, it's not really funny. It dates me terribly, but it used to be that when we would go on a road trip, we would get a map. Imagine that. It's just phenomenal what you can do with a map. And you lay it out and you figure out what route you're going to take and where there may be places you need to get off or whatever. And and you get fairly accustomed to using a map. And today we cheat something terrible. And that cheating's called GPS. And so we don't even plan for the journey, which is probably appropriate given how we do our journey. Because we don't plan, we just put in the coordinates and hope for the best, and point the car in the right direction, follow the map, quote unquote, the map that tells us what turns to take and when, and all those sorts of things. And I'm not going to wax, reminiscent about the good old days when there was a map or anything like that. But I can remember that oftentimes I would be driving, my wife would be in the passenger side, and she would have the map out and say, "What's coming up and what do I need to know?" And we would do that. We lovingly would refer to the person in the passenger side as the navigator. It sounds really official. And so there is that element to it that we have to take into account. But I think the one thing that is absolutely true is that when you pull up a map, whether it's Google Maps or maps in Apple devices or whatever, there is one thing that is marked on the map, right? And that is that little pin that is dropped where you are. And then you figure out where you're going to go, right? And so the first key principle to understanding or even looking at what our journey might be is you can't go anywhere if you don't know where you are. If you have no idea where you are, then how in the world are you going to figure out where you're going? And there are lots of us that tend to just head off in some direction, hoping for the best. And we've gotten, like I said, kind of spoiled that GPS is going to save us because we don't have any idea of a map. Now, there are lots of fiction and things like that have a map. I mean, all of the great epic kinds of stories and series, like The Lord of the Rings or other ones, there's always a map that somebody has, and it's often the most valuable thing that anybody can get their hands on because it lets them know where they're going, and it also helps them place where they are. So no matter where you are in the spiritual journey, you need to figure out where you are, and that's the first principle. The second one is this, is you can't lead somebody to somewhere you've never been. And if we're going to walk this spiritual journey, one, we need to know where we are, and two, we probably need to look to someone that has been where we want to go, not somebody that is just going with us. Now, I'm not saying traveling companions aren't good. They are. They're great. They keep us company and keep some perspective and all of those things. But it can truly be the blind leading the blind in a lot of ways. So if at some point in time you have a desire or a hope that you can mature and go through this journey and be able to come back down the road to help other people travel that road, then you better go down the road a little bit, to be kind of obvious. So there are a couple different things that I want to introduce right out of the gate when we talk about it and why it's referred to as the critical journey. We think it's the spiritual life. We have a lot of different metaphors or synonyms for it. The interesting thing about it is that early Christians were not called Christians. And the first record, at least in Scripture, of people who are following Christ being called Christians isn't until much later in a church in a church in the location called Antioch. But up until that time, they were often referred to as followers of the way. the way. And that captures the idea of forgiveness. Now, as we go through this journey, I think in a lot of ways, most people will understand if they've been on this journey for any length of time, they understand that, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink here just for a second. They understand that the journey begins with repentance. And I talked about this in a previous episode of the podcast, where I have to not only change my direction, but I also have to change my mind and head back to the identity, my original identity, as God designed it, if you will. So I don't get to design my own identity. God gives me that identity, and I go back to reclaim it in this thing we call repentance. And then we have the forgiveness of sins, which is offered us before we ever repent. That's still there. And then the journey continues and progresses with growing obedience. Now, let me make something really clear. We think of obedience as an adherence to a set of rules or laws or whatever. The interesting thing about that is that obedience, when you look at the word obey, all right, the core of the word obedience, the word obey comes from a Latin word that means to listen intently. Now, the last I checked, it doesn't say anything about following a rule. It doesn't say anything about that. It says those who listen intently. So obedience is listening intently, and that listening translates into, which goes back to the thing we talked about with repentance, that listening goes back to changing my mind and changing my direction. We think of obedience as adherence to a rule rather than listening intently, having my heart changed, and then I change my behavior. And then it goes through obedience, which is listening intently, changing, bringing my choices and behavior in line with what I'm listening to, a relationship that is built over time, a progressive change of one's character over time, fancy word is sanctification, and ultimately it consummates at Jesus' second coming. Now, whether you believe all that stuff or not is not the point. The point is that the journey actually has way markers along the way, or waypoints along the way, for us to pay attention to and to see where we are on the journey. And maybe we have to sit for a while and take in where we are. Maybe we have to retrace our steps because we think we're on the journey, but we've veered off course, whatever that might be. But the thing to keep in mind is the travel that we engage in on this thing called the journey is both on a redemptive level in terms of me changing over time and being redeemed. And again, these words are really, dare I say it, churchy words, right? We redeem coupons. We go in. We don't have coupons as much anymore today than we used to. But we redeem coupons to save money or to trade for another item or whatever that might be. But we don't think of personal redemption. What does that mean? And it's trading my old for my new. That would be redemptive level. So the travel not only includes a redemptive process that changes me over time, but on a missional level in terms of where I am heading and what I am trying to do. In a lot of cases, obedience is not an act. Obedience is actually a long listening that changes one's behavior over a period of time. It's not what we have made it into, because making it into just an act makes it measurable and makes it so that I know whether I'm getting it right or not. But having something measurable and getting something right doesn't require trust. And trust is shown when I get it wrong, not when I get it right. It's also where I learn about what grace actually means. So the journey itself, this thing that I'm talking about, the journey itself occurs in a cyclical way, not in a linear way. And that's the thing that has always bugged me about stages, is they tempt us into a certain level of linearity in terms of how we think. But this happens at a cyclical level. And so you have repeating stages, if you want to put it that way. That doesn't fit us. But the thing I want you to keep in mind is, at least in the mountains, and I haven't seen this as much because I haven't hiked nearly as much as I wish I had in the mountains. But I'm told that when you're traveling on a path, that oftentimes there's not flags or signs, or there's cairns or waypoints, things that tell you whether you're on the path or whether you're not. And waypoints help us know that, all right? So that's more of what we're going to be talking about here. I apologize for my voice. I didn't realize it's as scratchy as it sounds. But the waypoints that tell us whether we're on the path or not. If we lose a waypoint by the time we should have one, then we know that we're probably off course. Cairns are also an example. Cairns, spelled Cairns. I can take my headphones off. I don't need these. Cairns are also an example of that. So spiritual journeys reveal a similar pattern. The thing to keep in mind is everyone is on a spiritual journey. We just differ in our details, the things that impact us in particular ways, and our experiences, the environment we grow up in. All these things are very much a part of the landscape of what you would refer to as a journey. So the other thing to keep in mind is, and this is a number of introduction points. I know it might belabor it, but hang with me. The journey is fluid. It is not something that is just linear, okay? The way I explain it is, here in Colorado, at least in the Front Range, there is a particular mountain everybody knows about because it can be seen on the northern horizon of that we look out at the Front Range, and it's Long's Peak. And imagine for a moment, and those of you who aren't in the Rocky Mountain Range, you can look it up. But imagine for a moment if we were to traverse that mountain, not straight up as common sense would suggest, but to traverse that mountain in a circular fashion, okay? At the bottom, it would be a long, long hike, right? Because a lot of authors like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien often talks about the roots of the mountain or the shoulders of the mountain. And it's a long walk. If you're marking where the elevation starts to climb, it's a long walk all the way around. But imagine for a moment you were to think of life that way, And we have a very long walk at the bottom. And as we traverse and continue to go higher and higher, we get higher, but the path always looks the same. And imagine with me for a second, if on that particular mountain called your life that you're climbing, there's a ravine that runs the entire length of it up the side of the mountain, which means that every time you come around, you hit the ravine again. And you climb through it, and then you go around, you hit it again. And oftentimes what I have found, people make the conclusion that when they hit that ravine, it means that they're back to square one. And they never look back. They certainly don't have anybody speaking into their lives about where they are on their journey up the mountain. But the ravine's always the same. But I continue traversing, and that is closer to what our spiritual journey is like. So what's key to understand in this setup of what I'm talking about here is this is how we grow. I gain in strength at the lower elevations, if you will. I gain in competence. I gain in knowledge. I gain all these things so that as each time I go farther and farther up the mountain, my competence grows, my confidence grows, all sorts of things tend to grow. And our tendency is that when we're lower on the lower levels, we think we won't change at all. And so even though we're walking and traversing, we think that where we are right now, we get really discouraged and say, this is never going to change. This is not going to get any better. This is going nowhere. So, but this is fundamental to growth, if you will. I jokingly set out my window as I watched one of my grandkids learn how to ride his bike. It's like spring break's perfect for learning new skills. And he's going to learn. He's going to fall. And if he falls and he says, I'll never get this, and he stops, the outcome's always the same versus getting up and trying it again and learning a little bit more about balance, all of those sorts of things. So ultimately, this is what you might call our struggle to find fulfillment. The problem is we try to engage this journey just like we would any other performance, not a journey, but a performance that comes to an end, and then I can evaluate it. We don't see it as an ongoing process of growth and development and failure, which is key, and success, and all of that. And ultimately, one of the problems we tend to do is take our expectations of performance and put it on the whole journey, not just part of it, not just the one I'm in, but the whole thing. And if I'm doing really well, I can do this forever. If I'm doing really poorly, I'm never going to make it. So it oftentimes it's how I evaluate this is how it looks, not as much about how I participate in it, how I engage it. Now, the other issue that we get is getting stuck spiritually, and part of that is managing expectations. Now, the challenge is, of course, is that the next year of life we've never gone through before. And we create certainty by thinking it's exactly the same as the one before. But if we look back, we know that it never is, which doesn't help us much because we're not real sure what to do with that. How do you adjust expectations? So we have two different things that we have to manage. One is expectations, and the second thing is frustration. And my tolerance for frustration. And generally, where we go with frustration is shame. It's like, I knew I was a failure. I could never get it right. I'll never get it right. And that's how it always goes. So why bother? So I already predict what the future is going to be, rather than let's keep going. Let's keep trying and seeing how this goes. So there's that, managing expectations and frustration. And then there's also managing crises. See, life doesn't stop when we get into this journey with Jesus. It doesn't stop. There's things keep happening. And crisis isn't always negative. And that's something to keep in mind, because crisis can be, for example, let me give you an example. When we talk about stress, there used to be, many years ago, there was a stress scale called the Holmes and Ray. And what they determined was what they called life stress units. And those units were calibrated against what impact it had on the person's life. So you can probably guess what the top of that list was, right? Death, of course, divorce, broken relationships. You know what else was up there, which I can really relate to, is family vacations or getting married. Two positive things, hopefully, but they're still stressful, right? And so crises are going to occur. And how do we manage them? How much competence have I developed going into them? All of that comes in. And then the last thing I'll mention, or actually I have two more things I want to mention. First is the idea of transformation. All of us affirm the idea that we are being transformed, particularly when we follow Jesus. We're going to be transformed because we're going to try to bring our thoughts, our feelings, our conclusions in alignment with what he has taught. But we have expectations, and sometimes those expectations sabotage our very own transformation. Because transformation, and this is key, transformation requires trust and surrender, not resignation and passivity. See, transformation, by its very name, means moving from one substance to another substance. In the Greek, it's the word metamorphosis, which oftentimes when you hear the word metamorphosis, you attach it to butterfly, right? Worm to a butterfly, earth crawler to a flight. But see, transformation requires trust because it requires somebody bigger than me to accomplish that end. And ultimately, surrender is part of trust. But it's not passivity. It's not resignation. It's not, oh, well, this is going to happen. All I have to do is just get out of the way and things will happen the way it does. No, it doesn't. I still have to engage it, which leads me really to my last point, and that is spiritual growth occurs through the synergy of God's grace and my personal effort. Personal effort is still part of it. We tend to substitute personal effort for God's grace. So what does synergy even mean? Most of the time people will nod their heads and say, yeah, I got it. I know what you're talking about. When in fact they don't. Because synergy means the interaction. I looked it up. You should be proud of me. I looked it up. The interaction of two or more agents or forces, God and me, that when they're combined, the effect is greater than the sum of their individual effects. Interesting thought, right? So it's the synergy of God's grace and my engagement in it, my effort to do it. It doesn't mean I just sit back and wait for God to do something. I have to do something. The problem is most of the time we don't want to do something because we want to make sure we do it right, instead of doing something, learning, and trying it again, just like my grandson was learning to ride the bike. We might, on a good day, we might understand grace. And we definitely understand personal effort. We got it. But what does it mean for those two things to actually interact? And it means I act and God accentuates. I act and God accentuates. So, and there are a couple different places, if you're curious, in Scripture where Paul talks about it in Philippians. He says, what I'm getting at, this is really interesting. This is out of the Message, and I thought it was interesting to share with you. What I'm getting at, friends, is that you should simply keep on doing what you've done from the beginning. When I was living among you, you lived in responsive obedience. And now that I'm separated from you, keep it up. Better yet, redouble your efforts. There's that personal effort. Be energetic in your life of salvation, reverent and sensitive before God. That energy is God's energy, an energy deep within you, God himself willing and working at what will give him the most pleasure. Now, you may have your own history with God, and I understand that and get it completely. You might have your own history, and that may not be terribly comforting. I get it. I understand. At the same time, us putting forth our personal effort to accomplish certain things, whatever they are, we get them, we accomplish them, and say, yeah, but is this all there is? Isn't there more? I think that's what's missing, is that the energy God gives us by his Holy Spirit in us actually gives a depth of meaning that we wouldn't otherwise get if we just do it by personal effort. So, all right, enough of introduction. One last thing, and that is a quote from St. Augustine. And I thought this was very telling. Without God, we cannot. Without us, God will not. An interesting quote. So we have to understand the seasons and stages and dynamics of our spiritual journey. So we have to have some way that we can engage in the plan, if you will, or the process of growth. It doesn't mean we have to have it all mapped out. It doesn't mean that at all. But we do need to understand it. And that brings me then to the very first stage. And the stage is referred to as the converted life. Okay? And this is the discovery of God through conversion, through being a new creation, a new birth, and an embrace of the justification by faith. Oftentimes it's a result of awe. God is incredible, and the grace that's offered me in the face of all of my failures is often overwhelming. There's a prophet in the Old Testament, Isaiah, that said exactly the same thing. Or our drawing to God is a sense of need. It's like, I can't do this anymore. There are a lot of people out there that experience that. And they say, the way this goes, I keep going, I'm going to die. I can't be trusted even with myself. And so there's one aspect to this that I want to highlight for you. And that is at stage one, or the first leg of the journey, if you will, is there's a sense of feeling kind of caught and caged. Instead of feeling love and awe, we think of God and others as constantly having expectations of us that we can't possibly measure up to. And quite honestly, just to be blunt, we can't. But we are still caught in this web of I must perform instead of I must embrace my personhood, who I am. And we don't think that's enough. Quite honestly, we just don't. And so what happens is we end up dwelling on not fulfilling other people's expectations rather than learning and living into the fullness of who God made us to be. And so we're still at this stage of this leg of the journey, we're still living by our old ways of handling things. That's completely understandable. But that's That's a part of it. It's comparing ourselves to other people. And sometimes it's comparing ourselves to people that are way further down the road and say, I should be there by now. I mean, after all, it was just yesterday I accepted Christ. And so we can get stuck, and we can have this sense of personal unworthiness and shame about who we are and where we came from. Or on the flip side, and I've had people tell me this, is they compare their story in terms of growing up in a Christian home with Christian parents and coming, accepting Jesus into their lives and being on kind of a steady trend line of relationship with God, and compare that to what looks pretty milquetoast vanilla compared to people that have a tumultuous spiritual story where they've crashed and burned, and at the bottom of the barrel at where they are, they come to Jesus. And that's us still doing our old stuff. So before the journey, that's the old stuff. And then when we're on the journey, we still use our old expectations and everything else that goes along with that. So this first leg of the journey, we're in not only converting, if you will, our lives over to following Jesus, but we're converting a lot of other things during this time. And that's okay. That's part of it. I mean, the thing that's different between us and little kids is they just grow through it. We're having to walk through it, and we have all of our faculties as an adult oftentimes, or a young adult, and we can look back, but we're still doing all these comparisons, and I think it sabotages right out of the gate into our journey with Jesus. We're sabotaged right from the beginning because of that very thing. And that's one of the issues that comes up, I think. The other side of it is it's almost as if grace is too good to be true. Now, the funny thing about it is, you're right, it is too good to be true. But instead of embracing that to say, I have been offered this grace, and I've been given a space to learn how to grow into the very person God created me to be. Now I need to learn as I go. And that's the journey. That's that cycle that I talked about before that is very much a part of it that we have to keep in mind. So that's the first leg of the journey, all right? I'm going to call them legs of the journey rather than stages, because stages we'll just get confused. But that's the first leg of the journey. There are a number of things in here that how I start the journey has everything to do with how I continue the journey, not how I end it, because that's way, literally way down the road. But how I engage the journey is a very big part of what we're talking about. So that's it for tonight. I'm going to stop at that particular leg of the journey, and I'll come back to it for the next edition of this. It will probably be 2 or 3 weeks away, and I'll come back and refresh your memory about where I've been, and then we can go from there. So if you have any questions about some of the stuff that I've talked about or how it relates to your journey, DM me your questions on Instagram. Please do. I would love to hear from you and add it into some of the things that I'm talking about here. We have the feature on the website now where you can subscribe and be notified of any new content. So you can go down to the very bottom of the homepage and find "Stay in Touch," or and you'll be notified of anything new. So you can subscribe there. The other feature, which I changed a little bit because people were getting a little confused, is the email devotionals. I started that up a few weeks ago, called Setting New Boundaries, and it's a journey into healthy relationships. And it's an email devotional. It comes to your inbox every other day. It supports the mission and vision of SGI. And there's a page that's set aside for that now. So you can find it under CCU drop-down menu. You'll see Setting New Boundaries devotional or Setting New Boundaries. And you can go to that and subscribe to it. And you can subscribe however you want. You can do it monthly, you can do it semi-annually, or you can do it annually. It supports the the fund that helps to support students going on silent retreat and some of the other activities that we do within what do I want to say, SGI. Okay. So you can follow us on all three, or not all three, but three social media outlets. Instagram, we can be found at The Psych Monologues, at Facebook, Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn, Dr. Mitch. Those are the three major outlets that you can find us on. If you want to follow and subscribe to the podcast, please do. If it's encouraging and gives you food for thought and something to chew on, please subscribe. It would be great to have you. And if it really is helpful, write a review. Helps kind of increase our profile for people to find us. We can be found on any of the major outlets or platforms that you listen to podcasts on. That includes Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio. Since I've turned to doing the video podcast, you'll see a reel on Instagram shortly after I release this. Or if you'd like to go to the website, you can see it on the website as well. The full video of this podcast. If you're interested in partnering with us, first of all, I'd say thank you. It would be immensely helpful to support and make it possible for students to engage in a silent retreat. And so you would help us grow the scholarship fund, not only for alumni of CCU, but other students. All your gifts are tax deductible. We are now a tax exempt organization. And you can decide where it goes. If you want it into the general mission fund for SGI, you can do that. Or if you want to set it aside for silent retreats, or you know somebody that you want to support and help them afford a silent retreat, you can do that right on the website to accomplish that. If you prefer to send a physical check, you're welcome to do that as well. You can send it to Stained Glass International, P.O. Box 160, Eastlake, Colorado 80614. There's a Donate Now button on the homepage and all the other pages on the website that allows you to give to SGI that way as well. But if you'd rather send us a physical check, you are more than welcome to do so. Again, the address is P.O. Box 160, Eastlake, Colorado 80614. That's it for tonight. Thanks so much for hanging with me for all the introduction about the spiritual journey. I hope it's been helpful and encouraging to you, and we will certainly have more to talk about in the days to come. But until that time, I'll be here waiting for you for the next time. Love ya. Later. Bye.